So, as I say, my name is Guillermo Rivera. I use the pronouns he, him, or él en español. Y I'm the housing justice organizer for Eastside for All. Eastside for All is a nonprofit organization that advocates for racial equity and social justice in the east of King County. Because we're talking about housing and land, first, I want to recognize the first indigenous settlers in this region. We are occupying the ancestral lands of coastal Salish, including Dunamis, past and present, who have lived here for many generations, caring for the land and contributing to our region in countless ways. We give thanks to the earth and to our indigenous neighbors. But recognition like this should not replace the real work of building authentic relationships and the practice of centering the needs and contribution for our indigenous communities. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, FutureWise and Brady Nurseries, for their support and in this series and for their work through the east side of King County. Thank also to Chris Reynolds from Complete Streets Bellevue for their support and expertise in creating this event, and also Livable Kirkland and Bob Up for helping us to promote this event. This is what we'll be talking today, right? And at the end, like I say, we want to have some discussion. We're planning to have these presentations 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then the discussion. The next one. So the East Side was once home of the Native American tribes with rich identities, cultures, and histories. They were Dunamis, Snoqualmis, and Muckleshoots. They have a rich oral history, cultural traditions, number systems, and technology. You will see in all this presentation a lot of beautiful pictures. This is one that I love it. It was taken in 1855. This is another picture that is what the tribal settlements might have looked like on the 1800s, right? You can see part there of Lake Washington, and I mean, it looks different these days. So this image is from King County section of map of Indian nations and tribes of the territory of Washington commissioned by Isaac Stevens in 1857. Most settlers came in the 1850s. They introduced the seeds, like smallpox, to native tribes, and these diseases reduced the populations of native tribes. Also, the Donation Land Claims Act in 1850 granted 320 acres of land to adult citizens. Let me repeat this. The Donation Land Claim Act in 1850 granted 32 acres of land to an adult U.S. citizen, not to native people, right? Do you think like the native tribes participate to create the donation land claims, that they participate in how that was writing? Of course not, right? This law was made only from people in power. And the same thing can happen right now if we don't participate in city councils, in the legislative session. People are making decisions that will affect us for a long, long period of time. So we have the opportunity. Let's do it. Let's participate. The white people also create native territories and reservations, right? And the pattern of pushing unwanted people to less and less valuable land has continued through the 20th century and is still happening through today economic forces. Now we will talk about how the East Side grows and was fueled by economy and opportunity. This photo is from downtown Newcastle in the 1890s, I believe. Yeah. So the main cities of the East Side started as hubs of industry and trade. Bellevue with farming, coal, mining, logging, etc. Kirkland started with iron, steel, and farming. The ferry to connect Seattle with the East Side, that came to Kirkland first. Redmond was a lumber mills and saloons. That was the main thing like they have in Redmond at the time. And many of the names of our cities came from the early settlers like Luke Redmond, Peter Kirk, and Aaron Mercer. Kirkland, like I say, was the biggest city on the east side until Bellevue took over in the mid-20th century. I love these pictures. Like I say, we have a really cool pictures in this presentation. You can see Coal Creek Mines, Bethel, the Weller in Maidenbower Bay in Bellevue, Coal Creek Miners. I just love these pictures. Starting in 1925, Bellevue hosted a multi-day strawberry festival to show their prize corp on the way of life. By 1935, more than 15,000 people attend the festival, nearly 5 times of the number of people that live in the small town of Bellevue at the time. The 3-day event continued to be held annually until 1942, the year that 55 local Japanese families were forced to go to an internment camp. And Chris will be talking more about this in future slides. The East Side has been driven by upper middle class vision of individual home ownership. Ideal that every family had a unique home in the country. People want to preserve that identity. Part of the East Side have been economically exclusive since the 1890s, like Medina. That Medina was also where the sites of native tribes. After World War II, the East Side grew really rapidly and suburbanized, especially after the creation of the Lake Washington Floating Bridge in 1940. Many people who live in the East Side will commute to Seattle and other places by cars. Economic growth really took off after development of Bellevue Square by Kepler Freeman in 1946. This created a commercial destination on the east side of people to visit. More economic growth came when Microsoft headquarters settled in Redmond in 1986. And this set the stage for more tech companies to move to the east side. This picture shows how quickly the east side changed. This is downtown Bellevue in 1958, and I don't think it's now, but this is more recently. I don't think like we have one for today, but it's pretty recent. At the end, like I say, we'll have a discussion portion, and we want to start thinking that you start thinking about when Amazon and other major employers adding 35,000 high-paid jobs just in Bellevue in the next 2 or 5 years. How do you think that will be the future of the East Side, and how that impact communities, especially who was living here for a while, will have this impact? And now I will pass it to my good friend Chris Randolph for Complete Streets Bellevue to continue this presentation, and I will come back at the end.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Guillermo, for all that great information. So yeah, just to introduce myself, Chris Randalls. I am the director of Complete Streets Bellevue. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm going to explore a few different things today, but I'll start by sticking with my brand, and I'll start off with transportation. Because as important as it is to look at the history of our region through the lens of economic growth and development, so too is it important to look at this all at how our transportation networks have enabled people to get around the region, as well as who they've enabled and who they've not enabled. And I'll say that this relationship goes both ways. The transportation infrastructure itself has been influenced by economic growth and prosperity, but the infrastructure in turn also influences how our region grows and develops. So really just starting off and setting the scene, in the early 20th century, the East Side was absolutely hard to get to. For a long time, the Kirkland Ferry, ferry between Seattle and Kirkland, which is pictured on the left, was the main way to get to the east side. There were other ferries to other cities and on the east side, as well as from other points in Seattle. But Kirkland was really the main destination at the time because, as Guillermo mentioned before, the economic opportunity that was presented by the shipyards that were centered in Kirkland. But the ferry still took a really long time. In fact, residents of the East Side and Gold Coast communities often describe the area as being on island time, just because the pace of life was more relaxed and disconnected from the bustling city of Seattle. And it just, the removal, the distance, the perceived distance gave it a certain laid back feeling. You could, of course, always take a long way around the lake, but that definitely took some time, even more so than the ferry itself. Everything changed, though, when the floating bridge opened, as Guillermo mentioned. The floating bridge fundamentally changed dynamics on the east side because it was built on the shores of southern Bellevue and near the neighborhood of Untitled today. It made Bellevue the new hub of the east side, and in turn kind of shifted desirability from Kirkland to Bellevue. This was really cemented when the ferry to Kirkland closed in 1950. So the bridge itself helped build a suburban, auto-oriented, upper-middle-class vision of the east side. After World War II, a lot of real estate ads sold Bellevue, frankly, as 15 minutes to your home in the country. So again, kind of using this language of an escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. This vision of Bellevue as the new metropolis of the East Side, as well as the floating bridge, were spearheaded in large part by Miller Freeman, who is the grandfather of Kemper Freeman Jr. Both these names are going to come up a decent amount today. So since the East Side was hard to access historically, it became an escape for upper, middle, and upper class families, which, because of the history of this country, has, of course, historically furthered racial exclusion. Transportation networks themselves have both reflected this exclusion and, in turn, in partial turn, caused it, as I mentioned previously. So, for example, unlike Seattle, in the earliest 20th century, public housing on the east side in the early 20th century did not allow non-white tenants, whereas Seattle's public housing did. So Black ship workers that were working in Kirkland were forced to take the long ferry ride every day in order to access their jobs, their employment opportunities. There's well-documented history of how after the mandatory desegregation of schools in Seattle, many white families flocked to the east side, which of course furthers patterns of exclusion and who feels like they belong on the east side. Transportation has absolutely played a role in this. The floating bridge, which provides easy access for those who have a car, when combined with Bellevue's history of automobile-centric development, it sends a particular message, both functionally and conceptually, that the East Side and Bellevue in particular are really only for those people who are able to afford a car. And there's been institutions that have tried to further this vision and further this paradigm as key actors still attempt to advance this notion of the supremacy of the automobile. And just going to Kemper Freeman Jr., I mentioned that name before, back in 2009, after voters approved ST2, the light rail expansion, he sued to attempt to stop the expansion of light rail into East Side communities. And the suit ultimately did fail, but he was still able to have a significant say in how the line was developed. So, for example, the central downtown Bellevue station is not actually located centrally in downtown where it would provide more convenient access to local businesses and jobs. It's actually positioned to the east of the transit center, which was in part due to his influence. And again, it kind of furthers this message of that Bellevue isn't for people who take transit, i.e., if you can't afford a car, you shouldn't be on the east side, which is not a great message to send when people without cars already exist on the east side. Recent city demographic data shows that 10% of Bellevue households don't own cars. And not all of those people who own cars are low income, of course, but it's still a really harmful message to imply that people without cars don't belong in a city when they already exist there. So we're going to have time at the end, as Guillermo mentioned, we're going to have time at the end of the talk to take part in a discussion with you all. But in the interim, just to kind of get those brain juices flowing, be thinking about some of these questions as they relate to transportation. How does transportation affect your life on the east side? And how will light rail, when it opens, whether in 2024 or 2025, change how transportation plays an impact on your life? What can we be doing? What can each of us, what can our institutions, what can our cities be doing to make sure that we make the east side more accessible and inclusive for everyone? And let's get kind of a little bit conceptual here, but let's get into this question of inclusion and exclusion. Key to this question really is the question of who. Who is the in-group? Who is the out-group? Who belongs and who doesn't? And who has the power to say who belongs? And these precise answers can change over time, which actually, as I'll get into a little bit later, gives us a lot of agency in how we can develop our communities. But I hope that through this presentation, you'll see some common threads and undertones that have, for better or for worse, pervaded throughout history. So to get at this question, we really can go back to the beginning of Bellevue's history. And Guillermo already touched on this a little bit, but it's good to start with Japanese people who began settling in Bellevue in the 1890s. The majority of them were farmers. Some would rent land, farm a plot for a few years, and then move to another plot. Until the passage of the Alien Land Law, many were actually able to amass enough wealth this way by tilling the fields and farming over the course of several years. They were eventually able to amass enough wealth to own land in the city. This large Japanese population had a significant impact on Bellevue and its institutions. Many students in Bellevue schools were Japanese. These communities established their own cultural institutions where they could practice their language and culture. There was a community center that was actually established north of the present-day Bellevue Square. They also established economic institutions such as the Bellevue Vegetable Growers Association, which was centered in what was then known as the Mid-Lakes area, now today the Wilburton commercial area. They actually established a train warehouse in that area so that farmers can more efficiently ship and sell their product. And one thing that's really fascinating to me as we were doing research for the presentation is that Japanese people, by and large, are really the ones that made land more usable in the city. When Bellevue started, it was heavily forested. It was a lot of marshland. We still see this today in a lot of areas of the Mercer Slough. That's really what a lot of Bellevue looked like at the time. And from the city's origin, it was Japanese laborers who were the ones that were doing this dangerous work of clearing the land, removing tree stumps, using dynamite over the course of several months to clear a plot of land. This was very dangerous work, risky work, and many lost limbs and some died. It was backbreaking, and in many ways, it was labor that was being done by these people that made the land more usable to the benefit of the actual landowner. So I just want to emphasize that as we continue this discussion, that Japanese farmers and Japanese people literally helped make the city what it is today, bringing wealth and prosperity by making this land ready to be developed and farmed. And on that farming note, as Guillermo mentioned before, Japanese farmers were most famously known for their strawberries. Bellevue became known for their Strawberry Days festival, but there were a lot of other crops as well. So in spite of the contributions of Japanese people to early Bellevue history and its many cultural institutions, there were people at the time who sought to demonize them and exclude them from the city. And this is where we have to return to Miller Freeman. And we really have to be explicit and start this conversation by saying that Miller Freeman was a white supremacist. He did not believe that non-white people could belong, not just on the East Side, but on the West Coast at large. You see the quote on your screen there. And unfortunately, it would be bad enough if he was just some Joe Schmo with these beliefs living in isolation. But because he was a wealthy man with connections to politicians, generals, and media institutions, he used these connections to publicly and privately advocate for policies that would advance these beliefs and this worldview. He used his connections in media to regularly publish articles and op-eds, sharing his positions with the wider community. In doing so, he furthered conspiracy theories, such as that Japanese people were really loyal to the Emperor of Japan and were merely waiting for the call to be able to fight for him. He was active in state politics to the point where he literally founded the Anti-Japanese League of Washington in 1916, and he even had connections to presidential administrations. He frequently claimed that his prejudices were not based on race, but that it was simply common sense. And unfortunately, his advocacy did have tangible impacts. And those impacts are really masterfully discussed in the book Strawberry Days by David Nywer, which goes into this topic in much more detail than what this brief presentation is going to be able to get into. But to put it really briefly, Freeman was an instrumental part in the process of restricting Japanese land ownership. There is a direct line that can be drawn between his advocacy and various policies and laws that were passed in the ensuing decades that systematically denied people of Asian descent wealth and prosperity. I mentioned that he founded the Anti-Japanese League of Washington, which directly led to the state alien land law which forbade Japanese people from owning land. This is how most Japanese were funded, systematically cut off from most land ownership. And as I mentioned, the Anti-Japanese League was a key actor in bringing this law into Washington State. Returning really quickly to that land use point, again, I just want to emphasize how Bellevue's early Japanese communities were in large part pivotal in making the city developable, making the city able to be farmed and lived in. And imagine after all that work, you and your community are denied the opportunity to establish wealth and prosperity in that community. I can't even begin to imagine. Freeman also wrote letters to presidential administrations and military leaders, direct advocacy alongside others, but this advocacy directly led to the Immigration Act of 1924, which prevented the immigration of Japanese people into the United States. Unfortunately, this all culminated in with, as Guillermo mentioned previously, the internment of Japanese people in 1942. It was a response to public pressure from important public figures like Freeman, who openly called for it, again, through op-eds, through letters. And this, unfortunately, has permanently left scars on the Japanese community in Bellevue. When internment started and Japanese people were forced to leave their homes, a community leader in the Japanese community wrote an op-ed acknowledging that this was just goodbye for a time, that he and his community would be back. But during the war, opposition grew, which was fomented by Freeman, that showed that the community didn't want them back. Families that rented land overwhelmingly didn't return. The few that did own land that they were on, and that did return, often came back to see their houses ransacked. They were openly threatened. They were made to not feel welcome in this community that they had contributed so much to. And just to emphasize where we can still see that, just to hopefully provide a tangible connection to this history, the rail line where people were sent away from their homes, the Japanese people in Bellevue were made to go to a train depot in Kirkland, and they were sent along the rail line that is now presently East Trail, the trail infrastructure that exists throughout East King County. So, and I mentioned how they had established economic institutions in the Mid-Lakes area, the Wilburton area. So imagine having to be sent away from their community and being forced to ride right alongside your home, your institutions, and not knowing when you're going to be coming back. It's a terrible experience. And this is unfortunately just one way of how laws and policies formally further patterns of exclusion. Many of these policies are specifically related to housing and who could own land in the given community. We've already seen instances of that with the land exclusion laws. But another way that manifested was through racially exclusive covenants, which restricted those other than the white race from owning land in many cities and neighborhoods in our region. There's some examples listed on the slide. There's also a great University of Washington website that goes into way more detail than we're going to be able to, but this is documenting all these different racially exclusive covenants. There are several across our region, including one from Clyde Hill, which it was written in 1946, and it restricted homeownership exclusively to members of the Aryan race. So a very unfortunate aspect of our history. And I just want to emphasize, I want to use this time to say that these policies, these practices were really not that long ago. Many people in our communities, maybe even some people on this call, were alive during this time. This is not that long ago. And for reasons we'll get into a little bit later, these policies still have far-reaching impacts even today. They still impact modern life. So continuing with the theme of housing, I want to get into exclusionary zoning, which is a set of laws that place restrictions on the types of homes that can be built in a particular neighborhood. The purpose of zoning, as it was originally constructed, served a noble purpose. It was used to keep dirty industrial uses and fire hazards away from homes, to protect public health and safety. This came in the wake of the 19th century and industrial uses, and there not being enough regulation around the location of industrial uses close to homes. But by the middle of the 20th century, zoning laws have and had been unfortunately used to maintain higher property values and openly discriminate against people of color, especially single-family zoning, which is the designation where only one house can be built per plot of land. And the theory behind exclusionary zoning and housing and the relationship between exclusionary zoning and housing costs is that zoning, especially single-family zoning, it places this artificial constraint on housing supply that divorces supply from the actual demand that a community might have for housing. And so when we can't build enough housing due in some part to land use restrictions, demand for homes increases and housing costs go up since supply cannot commensurately grow to match that demand. Single-family zoning, in particular, also creates this stereotypical suburban pattern of development that is more auto-oriented, keeps people further away from goods and services, because when you can only have one house per lot, it necessarily creates these more sprawling development patterns, and what's kind of traditionally considered more stereotypical suburban development patterns. This development pattern, for better or for worse, thrived post-World War II, and the Eastside definitely followed suit in this pattern of growth. A great example of this pattern is actually my neighborhood of Lake Hills, where when the development was created, this neighborhood was created, only one home was allowed per residential property, which in turn, through this development pattern and the separation of housing from commercial uses like local shops, it helps support car dependence. People would commute into Seattle or the commercial areas to work or shop. In Lake Hills in particular, most people in that neighborhood were actually worked for Boeing, workers at Boeing at the time. And these patterns still persist today. Many cities still have the same restrictions on their land use. In Bellevue in particular, over 75% of our city's land is zoned for single-family housing only. We are seeing today pushback against changing this paradigm, but it's really just continuations of long patterns of advocacy. It's unfortunately nothing new. During the 60s, in my neighborhood again of Lake Hills, community advocacy reigned around preventing multifamily developments across from the Lake Hills shopping center because it was felt that they would disrupt neighborhood character and not be connected to the community. It was also fears that these developments would bring people of lower socioeconomic status and people of color. And this advocacy against multifamily continues today through stigma against renters, through claims that we're not as connected to the community or that we are transient. And it just really, it's really unfortunate. As mentioned on the slide as well, there were formal institutions that helped further this paradigm. The East Bellevue Community Council, of which I actually live in, was a body that was formed as Lake Hills was annexed into Bellevue. And its sole regulatory function was to maintain veto authority over land use decisions in its borders. Historically, this very frequently led to the vetoing of land use ordinances and projects that would support multifamily development and affordable housing. Now, HB 1769, which passed last legislative session, did abolish community councils, but even in this century, they were able to veto land use actions that would make it easier to build affordable housing, provide services for our homeless population under this banner of protecting neighborhoods, which in my opinion is itself an interesting linguistic exercise because it creates this framing of risk that people in affordable housing, people experiencing homelessness, are a risk to our way of life as opposed to members of our community, equal members of our community that belong and that we can provide assistance for. I'm starting to run short on time, so I'll try to zoom through these slides, but zooming out from the East Side just a bit, I wanted to make sure we devoted a slide to talking about a practice that was prevalent in a lot of communities nationwide. What many of you might have heard about was redlining. This was a discriminatory practice that restricted where people could buy residences based on their race and ethnicity. Banks, mortgage companies, and others would outright refuse loans for property transactions which they deemed as risky. Well, how do you determine which loans are risky? You do that by basing it on the percentage of people of color in a given neighborhood. And so this map on the right shows a redlining map of Seattle in 1936, showing how people would be unable to get home loans for large swaths of the Central District, which was an area that is overwhelmingly populated by Black residents and other people of color. And this was racist exclusion, quite frankly, endorsed and perpetuated by the federal government, that has led to significant impacts that persist to this day, which we'll get into in a bit. If you want to better understand this history of housing discrimination, I cannot recommend enough reading the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I believe that's where I first saw this map on the right, but he goes into numerous examples of how policies that were supported and vetted by the federal government led to patterns of housing exclusion. And just to dispel any notion that these are historically distant policies or far removed from the present day, there's evidence that Black and brown households were being unfairly targeted with subprime mortgage offers in advance of the 2008 housing crisis, which is a practice that the ACLU has described as modern redlining because race was used as a factor to decide loan terms. And that's just another way that Black and brown people to this day have been hit by systemic racism and led to disparate impacts during the Great Recession. So up to this point, we've talked about the ways in which through legal codes and policies, a certain vision of who can belong on the East Side has historically been furthered to exclude Black and brown people. But this exclusion has also been advanced through social pressures and other informal, non-legal methods. So, for example, let's say that you are a Black family that is not explicitly restricted from living in a certain neighborhood, but when you move in, you are accosted by neighbors. You are dissuaded from purchasing a home there. Then when you move in, your children are made fun of at the local school district, and they may be followed home, or you may be tailed when you're on your way home from work. You may receive death threats at your house that require you to report them to the FBI. And unfortunately, none of this is hypothetical. It's the reality that many Black people who moved to the East Side neighborhoods in the mid-20th century experienced. It was their day-to-day life. Tim Martin is a great example of this. He was the first Black man in Lake Hills. His family had all the above happen to them and more. He's an interesting example because although we've largely moved away from such explicit forms of racial exclusion, the definition of who belongs in our communities has changed through time, and the definitions of who can belong have changed. At first, it was only white people who belonged. And today, and even at the time, there were certain class connotations. And I think this is illustrated well in interviews. He gave the anecdote of how he was a well-to-do worker at Bowen. He was able to afford a middle-class lifestyle in Lake Hills. And although there was a lot of negative pushback when he first moved into the community, slowly over time, it seemed almost like the community stopped perceiving him as Black. In interviews, he recounted times when he had petitioners go to his door, asking him to sign petitions to prevent other Black families from moving into Lake Hills. And these people were seemingly unaware that by signing that petition, he would be denying that right that he himself gotten to other families. So in advance of our discussion later, just be thinking about these questions, because these questions of who belongs and who our communities are for have changed over time. And that, although that reveals a, unfortunately, racist history, that to me can be empowering, because it means that as we go forward through advocacy and policies, we can continue to push for more inclusive communities where everyone, regardless of race or socioeconomic status, can be made to feel welcome. I wanted to get into, before I switch it back over to Guillermo, how these historical wrongs still have impacts today. Because yes, it seems like a lot of these things are removed from the modern day, that these are things that happened in the mid-20th century, and it's illegal today to explicitly exclude people from housing because of race. So we've solved it, right? Well, no, because these histories of exclusion and just not being welcoming communities, that has created a pattern that has perpetuated racial inequities to this day. And a good vehicle to analyze this through is home ownership. For better or for worse, home ownership is the main vehicle for wealth generation in this country. It also provides a way to pass down wealth intergenerationally. However, when Black people were systemically prevented from acquiring property, they were therefore made to be unable to build equity and wealth in their families. That has direct impacts on their descendants and their families. And that has in large part contributed to the still present racial wealth gap that exists this day. It affects where people are able to live and call home. It affects who's able to afford that house in Bellevue versus who needs to move elsewhere. I'll dive into Bellevue specifically because it's what I know, because it's where I live. But when only 2.6% of Bellevue's population is Black, whereas communities in South King County are as high as 15 to 20%. We have to ask what policies led to these outcomes. And it's the same ones that have led to housing exclusion and classism today. And if we want to correct this, if we want to make Bellevue and the East Side a community where Black and brown people can feel more welcome and can establish community here, we have to acknowledge the history of racially explicit of racially explicit discrimination, and any policies and principles that we craft to correct that paradigm has to lead with inclusion, has to lead with creating more inclusive communities. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how you can be a part of that advocacy. But for right now, I'll switch it over to Guillermo.
So now we'll talk a little bit about what is the Eastside now and the immediate future that we are. So companies are continuing to invest in the Eastside, and the Eastside will continue growing. 10 companies are coming, and our city councils and legislators in Olympia right now are taking decisions about housing for the next generations, and we need to participate and not make the history repeats themselves, right? Plans are happening in all the cities. New bills in Olympia to rent stabilization and zoning restrictions. We're not going to those right now, but you should check it out. There's a lot of good things happening in Olympia for rent stabilization and other protections for renters. So we need to participate on this. And right now, since 1990s, the East Side has been rapid demographic changes, right? You can see here that in Bellevue has a majority of non-white residents. Foreign-borns in 1970 were 5% of the total of the population. In 2019, it was 41 of the total populations. People that speak another language than English in 1990 was 14%. Right now, I bet that it's more than 44%. At the end, we'll have a discussion, but we want to share with you all the different organizations that we are participating on this and how you can get involved with us. So this is really easy for you. You only need to, if you want to join the Eastside Housing Justice Distribution List, just scan the QR there, and I will send you some emails about the cool stuff that we were talking about that is happening in Olympia or in different city councils. I promise you that I will not send you too many emails. And at the same time, if you can scan the other QR, we want to hear from you how we did it, how we can improve these kind of workshops. If you can scan that and then do it later, but you should scan it right now.
Hi, I'm Bev Marcus, and I'm a member of the Livable Kirkland steering team. And we have a single action request today, and it has to do with housing, and it has to do with the comprehensive plan. So please sign our 2024 comprehensive plan petition to the Kirkland City Council. Voice your support for an affordable, sustainable Kirkland with more housing choices for all, and people-oriented, complete communities interconnected with efficient transportation. You can see the link on the slide. That link will be provided in a follow-up email. And you can connect with Livable Kirkland. If you go to the livablekirkland.org website, that is the best place to connect. You can see links to our Discord, our Facebook page, our mailing list, and Meetup. Again, those links will be provided in the follow-up email.
I should talk here. Hi, everyone. Brady Nordstrom from FutureWise, he, him. Thanks for attending this event. I just wanted to share really quickly some immediate actions that you could take. As many of you know, it's the middle of the Washington State legislative session. The fiscal cutoff for bills in their House of Origin is February 24th. That's Friday. And so there's a bunch of things that are coming up soon. And just as a quick overview, I mean, this year, FutureWise is leading an agenda, some bills that have to do with climate change through the Growth Management Act, similar to House Bill 1099. Last year, increasing housing options with missing middle housing, House Bill 1110. And then transit-oriented development and connecting people and communities. And so specifically with House Bill 1110, there's a hearing tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. at the Appropriations Committee. And so I'll send out this link in just a moment as soon as I'm sharing on my screen here. So I have to unshare it and post links in the chat. So I'll do that momentarily. But we need folks to reach out and let their state lawmakers know that they want this bill to go to the House floor for a vote. And also there's other things that are happening, and I'll post those too. So thanks, everybody.
All right, and then rounding us out, the best way to stay engaged on the Complete Streets Bellevue side is to sign up for the newsletter that's at the bottom of our website. We don't have any particular action alerts right now, but subscribing to the newsletter is going to be the way to stay engaged with any action alerts we may have in the future around Bellevue's comprehensive plan, state legislative actions like the ones that Brady has mentioned, any opportunities to testify at city council meetings, and any other events and gatherings we host. The newsletter is really going to be your way to stay engaged. So I'd recommend you go to that link and you sign up at the bottom of the page.